Welcome back, everybody, to the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod. This week, lots to cover. Congress is back to work after the shutdown ends. Movement in the U.S. Senate on digital asset market structure. I went to Texas. I went to Colorado. Had some interesting conversations there. New Hampshire is warming to Bitbonds. New Hampshire started a strategic reserve. Now they getting into the Bitbond game, which is excellent news. 60 Minutes goes totally off the rails. Since this is a delayed episode, we had some fainting executives in the Oval Office. God bless them. I guess a couple of weeks ago. I will cover it now and much, much more. Favorite shows, some entertainment news. We'll get into all of it. But remember to follow me on X at MorganSternNJ. Follow the pod on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, Rumble, wherever you get your podcasts. All right. Zach, what's our first topic?
Okay. Well, I just wanted to mention, as Brian said, we are off for a couple of weeks, and it is really fun to be back. It was really cool. Last week when we were off, you and I were in the guest seat of a podcast, which was a lot of fun to be on the other side of the microphone. But it is fun to be back here with you, and we're going to cover a lot of things that happened over the last few weeks. But I think that really do tie into what is happening now and what is going to happen over the coming months. And so the first story that we'll cover is that the longest government shutdown in history, it's now over. After 43 days, the Senate reached an agreement which was supported by 8 Democrat senators. And then the House came back to D.C. and they voted in a bipartisan fashion to pass the bill. President Trump ultimately signed and ended the shutdown on November 12th. But Brian, there's a lot to unpack here. So what were the impacts of the shutdown? How did both sides sort of reach a resolution? What is the status of funding for the long term or the short term? And then what is next on the agenda? A lot of questions, a lot to unpack.
Sure. So, yeah, and let's look at a macro picture of what the economy is doing right now. So the impacts of the shutdown appear to be short term. That is what most of the smart money is saying. EY estimates the shutdown created a 0.8% hit to GDP, but that will be recovered. And you see that because the Atlanta Fed is now predicting 4.2% growth in Q3. That is a pretty blowout number. Now, in my experience, that Fed is a little frothy with their predictions, but if they're even close to correct, then I think we're going to see the bull market back on pretty quickly, and we're already seeing it. So they just released a delayed jobs report for September. Analyst estimates were about 50,000 jobs for that month. Turns out 119,000. And when you peel back the layers, it was negative 3,000 government jobs. Haven't seen that in a while. During the Biden administration, a lot of the job growth was government and healthcare. This time, government shrinking, private sector growing. And not only that, it's Americans. American citizens are making up the lion's share of the jobs. And foreign workers are retreating at over 1 million. In this report. It's actually quite a bullish jobs report. NVIDIA, of course, the biggest part of the market, biggest company in the market, $4 trillion market cap, has the biggest share of the S&P 500. Everyone was watching their earnings report saying, can they possibly continue their momentum? It turns out they can, and they beat expectations. The market is rising as a result. So the shutdown, as we suspected, looks like it will be a mere blip, a bump in the road, but the economy is recovering quite nicely. Now, to your question about what happens next. So they funded the government through January 30th. There were 3 very small, easy bills, considered the easiest funding bills that went through for a full year of funding, but most of the government is only funded through January 30th, which means there could be another partial shutdown coming in January unless Congress gets its act together. In the process of reopening the government, some of the inflection points, of course, were the Obamacare premiums, which were expiring, the subsidies that were expiring, SNAP funding, which ran out briefly, and of course, flight delays because there were not enough air traffic controllers working. So one thing this shutdown did was launch into the discourse healthcare and healthcare reform, how to fund individual plans through the Obamacare markets. So President Trump is taking the position it should be funded through the consumers, and that if the government's going to do any kind of assistance, it should go directly to the consumers and then let them shop for their own plan. We will see if there is momentum for a healthcare reform bill. Those historically have been extremely difficult to pass, but it is top of mind. I think both parties are going to stake out a position in the coming months, and we'll see where it goes. It was a wild 43 days. Of course, the partisan gridlock is nothing new, but the longest shutdown in history, I guess, is notable in some way. Whatever. Like we said, it seems to have been a bump in the road, an opportunity for a great deal of performance art. So we'll see what happens from here. Of course, we had the 2025 election day that happened in the middle there, where the Democrats did well in New Jersey, in Virginia, in Georgia, of all places, mayor of New York, of course, a ballot initiative in California, mostly blue territory. And the Democrats did pretty well. So people thought that kind of emboldened them and that it might make them drag out the shutdown. Turns out, no, it was pretty much performance art. And they decided to come back to the table after even winning some elections. So I don't know. In short, there's going to be another funding fight in the new year. They're going to have to fund the government one way or another. Healthcare will enter the chat in a substantial way. Whether they reach any kind of legislative solution is anybody's guess at this point. But government's back open, bump in the road, economy starting to hum again, and onward.
And Thanksgiving, the sun will come up tomorrow. As hard as it is to go through these sort of episodes, things move forward. And on a positive front, one of the problems that we saw with the shutdown was that it did delay a lot of the substantive policy making in other areas, particularly the things that we talk about on this podcast a lot in the digital asset space. But there is some good news and progress on the horizon. Can you tell, Brian, the listeners, what's the latest on things like market structure? What's the news happening there? And then more broadly on the future of Bitcoin policy and where we go from here.
Sure. So as the listeners may recall, the Clarity Act passed the House. When they passed the Genius Act, they also passed the Clarity Act and the anti-CBDC bill sponsored by Congressman Emmer. So the Clarity Act, the broader market structure bill, has been sitting in the Senate. They are awakening from their slumber. So we have discussion drafts from the Senate Banking Committee and the Senate Agriculture Committees. They are aiming for a markup in December with a floor vote in January. That is according to Senator Tim Scott, chair of the Banking Committee. The issue with the Senate Ag Committee title is that there are more brackets than March Madness. Lots of unresolved issues on DeFi and other provisions, but there is a gang of Democrats that are negotiating, and we are getting momentum. And so if that timeline holds, then we may actually have a market structure bill passed in the new year, which could then give some bandwidth to tax issues and Bitcoin specific issues. And I do want to mention that this morning, Congressman Warren Davidson, as orange pilled as you can get, a great member of the House, he has introduced a strategic Bitcoin reserve bill, a Bitcoin for America bill, to legislatively codify the strategic Bitcoin reserve, and it would allow capital gains free tax payments in Bitcoin as a revenue neutral way to stack sats for the government and build its strategic Bitcoin reserve. Of course, he has cited rightly that the value of Bitcoin has gone up some 40,000% or something in the same span of time, a decade or so, when the value of a dollar has gone down by 20, 25%. So a budget neutral way to stack sats for the government, build the reserve. Great idea from Davidson. Glad that he is in Congress. We will see how some of the thorny sections of the market structure bill work out. The political momentum is there to do it. And like I said, if that gets passed, then we would turn to strategic Bitcoin reserve bills, Senator Lummis's legislation, the companion bill sponsored by Congressman Nick Begich in the House. Now we have Senator Davidson's bill. So perhaps some momentum would then be generated there. Tough to imagine something gets passed in an election year, but hope springs eternal. Of course, the tax package for digital assets would then also be next, and there is some real momentum for that. That could pass in the coming year. Just at a roundtable with Congressman Max Miller, he's working on this issue. He sits on the Ways and Means Committee. There are Democrats interested in working on this. They need to address issues like Bitcoin mining and staking and the tax treatment of Bitcoin. It's really being mistreated by just some old, outdated guidance by the Treasury Department. There are wash sale rules. There's a de minimis exemption proposal so that people can spend Bitcoin and not have capital gains taxes on small purchases. There's a variety of issues that they're working on. And that seems to be gaining real momentum so that when market structure passes, they can then move on to that issue as well. So that is the status. A lot of optimism. Whether optimism turns into legislation is the question. It seems, I'm fairly bullish on it. I think we're going to have a very productive next few months for digital asset policy in Congress, and that's very exciting.
I am too. I don't. I'm hoping it's not misplaced optimism, but I feel very optimistic, and also shout out to the committee staff in particular. I mean, I've seen this from kind of both sides of the aisle, or both sides of the coin, from being a former congressional staffer and then being a state legislator, and I know the amount of work that staff puts in. And so, for staff to put together a product, release it, have stakeholder meetings and seek input and stuff like that. I'm glad that they're taking this process as seriously as they are and doing it the way they are. So there's a lot of optimism. And so we'll see if we can get some of this stuff done in January and then start ticking off the other wins. Well, as we mentioned at the outset, we were off from this show last week because Brian was traveling. You were visiting some Riot folks in Denver, and then you spent some time here in the great city of Austin, Texas. So Brian, can you give listeners a rundown of your travels, some of the meetings that we had, and just some updates on some of the policy and regulatory issues that we're tracking?
Absolutely. So I got to go to Denver and visit with our Riot folks. Our data center team is there working very hard to design state-of-the-art data centers, which of course are in high demand these days. I visited ESS Metron, which is the manufacturing company that builds the switchgear, the electrical equipment that keeps our Bitcoin mines and other clients' data centers humming. It just highlighted for me, there really is no other enterprise like ours. We're doing things that have never been done before. And that's why it's really exciting. And we have extremely smart, hardworking people doing it. So great times learning a lot of detail about these aspects of the business, some of which I knew, some of which was just helpful to see in person, some of which was, it was great to just spend time with really fun, smart people, and we're all rowing in the same direction. So that was time well spent. Of course, then I was with you in Texas, and we met with a variety of people in the governor's office, the public utility commissioners, and one of the key takeaways. It sounds kitschy, it's a tagline, but it's true. The policymakers in Texas say we are moving at the speed of business, and that is true. The issues they're working on are very complex, but they want to find the best solutions for the citizens of the state so that everyone can be free and prosperous. A couple of the key concepts we discussed. Look, how do you accommodate the business growth that is carrying the economy, particularly in the tech sector, digital assets and in AI? And some of the ways you do that, you have to work on keeping the grid stable, even with these new large loads with interesting characteristics. Both, Bitcoin is inherently flexible, Bitcoin mining, and AI data centers are sort of inherently volatile in terms of when they're drawing large amounts of power and when they're not. So how do you keep the ancillary services market cheap and effective so that rates go down for ratepayers, but you're still providing enough power both for businesses and for your everyday Texans? And one way they're doing that is they appear to be valuing flexible loads. They're putting great value on them, and that's a great thing. It's both a state and federal issue. Both the Department of Energy and the Texas Public Utility Commission and ERCOT are exploring what I describe as an HOV lane a fast lane for large flexible loads so that we can use more of what we already have and what we've already paid for while we build what we need for the future. So a flexible load, for example, Bitcoin mining, because the network is decentralized, Bitcoin miners can behave like a dimmer switch and go up and down depending on what the needs of the grid are. A lot of AI data center developers now are including backup generation, batteries, and other tools on their sites so that if there is a time of grid stress, they can be using other sources while giving more energy back to the grid for everyday ratepayers. So that's the name of the game. How do we use what we already have more effectively, more efficiently, while we build what we need to accommodate the economy of the future? And that is really at the heart of some of these discussions. So with the Texas Public Utility Commission, as I said, we discussed flexibility on the grid and why that is important and how they can help foster that. We talked with the governor's office about regulations and how we can really just speed business growth. I mean, it's become such a destination, not just for tech, definitely for tech, but also for finance and other industries. We've talked about Y'all Street and how Dallas is going to have multiple stock exchanges there. JP Morgan has more employees now in Dallas than they do in New York. I mean, Texas is booming and they want to make sure that it continues to boom. And so that's why some of these conversations are very important. I guess to get a little bit in the weeds, we talked about, the HOV lane for getting businesses interconnected to the grid. There's also some issues sort of related to that. Low voltage ride through is an issue ERCOT is working on. That's when you have fluctuations on the grid. And I think of it as shocks on a car. You want to make sure that things stay stable for the passengers, which in this case, I think is Texans. So working on ways to ensure reliability there. I think the conversations are advancing reasonably well. Everyone is rowing in the same direction. You have some of the ancillary services. There's something called ERS in Texas, discussing how to keep that cheap and effective. Really, Bitcoin miners are a very important part of that. Batteries are another important part. But making sure that the cheapest options for ratepayers are still very accessible there. 4CP, that's the coincident peaks. That's when it gets really hot in the summer or really cold in the winter. And large loads can sort of wind down operations during those times. As a cookie, they can have essentially costs reduced because they're not using power at that time. So some of the fees and costs that go along with power use can be reduced. That's sort of their financial incentive. And then the result for the grid and ratepayers is you make sure you have plenty of power when everybody needs it, when they're running their air conditioners or they're running their home heating units, things like that. So very good and productive conversations. I think Texas is moving in the right direction, perhaps more so than any other state in the union at this point. They are doing everything they can to attract business, and that is totally evident from the meetings we had. I don't know. What did I miss? Any other takeaways from that visit?
No, you hit it all, and it is amazing. As population grows, I think it's so easy. People always focus a lot on like housing availability and affordability, and that's a big piece of it. But the broader infrastructure that is involved, that it requires: roads, bridges, broadband internet, water, energy, electricity. It's all of those things. That infrastructure needs to be in place to help Texas grow and to scale. And policymakers are approaching it from all of those angles and lenses. And we've had meetings on the water side of things. So we had great meetings, very encouraging. And it's amazing for a state that only meets, every other year. The legislature only meets every other year. There's still always so much happening at the administrative level, administering bills that pass and constitutional amendments that are adopted. So a lot of good meetings, and we look forward to welcoming you back to Texas the next time.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, this will be a fun one. So I joke and saying, since you're such an old man now, you watch 60 Minutes, but I watch 60 Minutes every now and again as well. I do enjoy watching Sunday football, and it kind of rolls right into 60 Minutes. But the episode last week had two stories that got you pretty fired up. So can you tell listeners about what those segments were?
Yeah. Paging Bari Weiss, your flagship show is a disaster. They covered two topics that we work on every day, and they were hopelessly biased. It made me wonder, if I know they're so off base on these topics, are they just as hacky on everything else that maybe I don't know as much about? It was disgraceful. So one segment was about President Trump pardoning the founder of Binance, CZ, because he was treated disproportionately. He was treated unfairly. I mean, any financial institution, TradFi Bank, and this has been pointed out, by the way, by the Winklevi. It's been pointed out by Pomp, by David Bailey, a number of Bitcoin luminaries who really followed a lot of these issues. It was during the Biden administration's war on crypto. It is hard not to believe that they went after Binance because it's the largest exchange in the world. Now, a lot of institutions have had issues with anti-money laundering or terror financing or other illicit funds sort of crossing through their platforms. They generally will have a fine. They have to update their policies and procedures to stop it from happening, and they go on their merry way. Well, in this case, he had to go to jail, step down from his position as CEO of the company that he founded, and the company really is not able to operate very fulsomely in the United States at all, the largest market for digital assets. So it was wildly disproportionate to how others similarly situated are treated. So seemed like a pretty reasonable pardon. He's also comported himself quite well in the aftermath. He's been very charitable. He's educating tens of millions of kids for free with his nonprofit. So, seemed like a fairly worthy pardon, not without controversy, of course. Not having effective anti-money laundering is not a good thing, and there's frequently punishments for those things. But this was just so wildly disproportionate and so obviously political and part of the war on crypto. The pardon made decent sense, and yet the entire segment was just about attacking Trump and claiming it was some kind of pay-to-play situation because the World Liberty Financial, which the Trump family is affiliated with, has had some dealings with Binance. Binance has pointed out they have tons of tokens. And if a token meets their requirements, they'll list it on the exchange. Anyway, they've been, defending themselves quite strongly. But 60 Minutes didn't have any of the counterfacts. It didn't have any of the reasons why it made sense to have this pardon. They had no mention of Biden's war on crypto and how this is a political issue. They had their witnesses in the segment were, a Biden administration pardon attorney, and they had Harvard law professor Larry Lessig, who's completely insane. And so they just talked about how, America's democracy is crumbling, because Trump made a pardon that actually made a lot of sense. So it was hopelessly biased, no balance in the story whatsoever, and just designed to slam Trump and be scary about crypto. So I thought it was hacky. I mean, hacky as can be. The other segment that really irked me was on AI, where they talked to the Anthropic CEO, Dario Amodei, who has been a AI doomer for a very long time. And as AI czar David Sachs has pointed out, this guy's been raising AI alarm bells, pushing for more regulation, in Sachs's estimation, for a regulatory capture strategy to make sure that their business model is the only one that's really allowed to succeed. This is not unusual. Regulatory capture happens, unfortunately, fairly frequently, but it seems like 60 Minutes has just been taking the doomer fear-mongering side of things and no focus on all the great things that are happening with AI, how they're making the workforce more efficient, how they're creating a ton of new jobs, how they're reskilling and upskilling people, how they're making really so many different facets of our economy more efficient. Instead, they interview the guy who says it's going to take all our jobs. As we talked about, like, we're going to need 500,000 electricians to deal with all the infrastructure build outs. We're going to have people move from administrative work to more thoughtful work that's going to create more GDP per capita, that's going to advance the economy faster in a whole variety of industries. None of that. It was all just gloom and doom and, AI is the worst and blah, blah, blah. I think 60 Minutes is basically designed to cater to an audience of old Trump hating crazy people, I think. I mean, that's what it seemed like to me after watching that episode. I tweeted out, I said, this show should not be on television. It was just wild, leftist, fact-free, fear-mongering propaganda, which it was. So I will go back to my first point, which is these are subjects we deal with every day. If they covered these subjects so poorly, what else are they messing up? I mean, it just made me lose complete trust in any of their coverage about anything. And I would be remiss if I didn't highlight, when I was at the White House, the president did an interview with Leslie Stahl, and he brought up the Hunter Biden laptop. And she said, oh, we can't confirm that. And he said, sure you can. And Hunter basically admitted it was his laptop. Everybody knew it was true. They just didn't want to report on it because they're a bunch of anti-Trump hacks. You don't have to, if you're 60 Minutes, you don't have to treat them with kid gloves. You don't always have to say nice things about Trump. That's fine. But you should be fair. And these two segments were anything but fair. They were just crazy fear-mongering, and they just hopelessly biased. So anyway, end of rant. 60 Minutes is dumb. Bari Weiss should fire every reporter and producer on that show and rebuild it from scratch into something that is actually worth watching. That is my position.
And it's really hard to take it seriously when, you have a bunch of guests that are talking about Trump is destroying democracy with these types of pardons. When you have people from the Biden pardon office who he pardoned his own son, and there's, the auto pen.
Pardoned his whole family.
Yeah. It's hard to take, it's hard to take that seriously. Well, speaking of interesting products, the state of New Hampshire is planning a, quote, first of its kind $100 million Bitcoin-backed municipal bond. So, Brian, you and Sam have discussed these so-called Bitbonds at length in previous episodes. For our listeners, you can go back in your podcast app and search for the episodes on Bitbonds to learn more about them. But Brian, for our listeners today, can you refresh our recollection on what is a Bitbond and why is it significant that a sovereign, a state like New Hampshire, is advancing or advocating for this type of model?
Yeah, this is exciting. Bitcoin is officially collateral. Companies are financing against it. Now you see a muni bond program integrating Bitcoin. I think to refresh everyone's memory, go back to what the great Sam Lyman wrote in Forbes about this. Bitbonds are like regular bonds in the sense that Treasury would allocate 90% of the bond to fund the government, but it would then use the remaining 10% of funds to purchase Bitcoin. Upon maturity, investors would receive 100% of the Bitcoin upside to 4.5% of the total compounded return, like a bond return. After this benchmark is reached, investors would receive 50% of all remaining Bitcoin upside, and the government would keep the other 50% of remaining Bitcoin upside to supply a strategic Bitcoin reserve and to help address the government's debt. That is the original idea for Bitbonds, or an original idea for Bitbonds. Now let's compare that to what New Hampshire is now doing. Under the proposed structure in New Hampshire, the borrower will post 160% of the bond's value in Bitcoin as collateral. And if Bitcoin drops below 130%, a liquidation mechanism ensures bondholders are made whole. This lets borrowers unlock capital without selling their Bitcoin or triggering a taxable event. That's a very important benefit. Now, according to BFA executive director, that's the agency in New Hampshire, James Key Wallace, fees from the bond transaction, along with any gains from in the Bitcoin collateral, will flow into the Bitcoin Economic Development Fund, a program to support innovation, entrepreneurship, and business growth in the state of New Hampshire. So a similar idea that investors can use their Bitcoin, the state can gain exposure to it. It can then help address the needs of the state. So this is big news because I believe Bitbonds are critical. Here's the most important thing. Bitbonds will allow governments to reduce borrowing costs. And as we've talked about on the show before, service on the U.S. government debt is one of the biggest expenses we have, along with Medicare, Social Security, the Department of Defense, the Department of War, excuse me. These are the biggest drivers of our national debt, which is destroying the purchasing power of the dollar for everyday citizens. So if you can use Bitbonds to reduce the borrowing costs and have bonds, at 1% or something, I mean, you're going to meaningfully reduce the debt. So the fact that there's this sort of pilot program with munis in New Hampshire, I think is a great experiment. Let's see how it goes. Let's see how this particular structure goes. And let's see if the state does well by it. Governor Kelly Ayotte touting her bona fides on being pro-innovation. I think this is a great way to test, to do a test run. Let's see how it works out. I ultimately think Bitbonds for America would be a good idea. It would reduce borrowing costs, most importantly, and that makes everybody's dollar stronger because it enhances the balance sheet of the U.S. government. So that's kind of what's going on here. I don't know if that was Greek to everybody, if they understood that, but I gave it my best shot. I don't know if you have a better way of talking about it.
No, I think that's a great summary. And it's also a cool thing. It kind of links the bridges from, people like Sam and Pierre who came before me. And now we're seeing these ideas that, it's so interesting in our space. We see these things like 3, 4, 5 years ago. People are kind of like, oh, what? That's weird. And then you explain it, you see it, being adopted and manifested. And New Hampshire and under Governor Ayotte, they are really, pro innovation, pro forward thinking. And it's kind of a neat model to see like two states. You got a giant state like Texas, who's got all the ingredients, and then you got a very freedomy state like New Hampshire trying to do this, and they're kind of in a race right now for Bitcoin policy supremacy. So it'll be interesting to see how this program works out and how it benefits folks, and if it is adopted elsewhere. Sometimes you got to be the first domino to fall and clear out all the other ones. Well, this is for our final substantive segment. This is a report that came out, I think it was maybe a month or two ago, and we've kind of been pushing off talking about it because so many other things have popped up. But I just thought it was an interesting report to note. And so, J.P. Morgan Chase, they are arguing in a recent report that the AI race is more than just a battle between the U.S. and China, but that it will redefine geopolitics more broadly, and warning that it will, quote, shake up global alliances, stoke fresh populism, and change the rules of war in the century ahead. I mean, that's clickbaity headline right there. But Brian, overall, what is your take on this report?
Yeah, good clickbait. I think that their observations are actually fairly obvious, but nonetheless worth repeating. So I'm going to jump to the TLDR. I'm going to jump to their list of key observations. One, assertive China investing huge sums to try to position itself as the forefront of AI development. No duh. Two, America is repositioning itself to counterbalance China's rise. I would position us as overcoming or defeating China's rise. Number three, the European Union is striving to reduce their dependence on foreign tech and bolster their own AI capabilities. The European Union is hopelessly over regulatory and not a good business environment. That's why, aside from moving some headquarters to Ireland for cheap corporate taxes, not a ton of headquarters would be leaving, for example, the US for Europe. I think they had a head start in digital assets for a little while, but I think people are starting to come back to the US. Number four is The Middle East sovereign wealth funds are leveraging energy abundance to become key players in AI infrastructure. That is absolutely true, as evidenced by yesterday's Saudi investment summit at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., where they announced hundreds of billions of dollars in deals, including with NVIDIA's Jensen and Elon Musk announcing deals to do data centers in Saudi. Of course, Saudi has a ton of energy, but they are working to diversify their economy away from purely an energy-based economy into other areas. Entertainment, of course, Live Golf is an example of that. Tourism.
Cristiano Ronaldo was at the White House. He's now a Saudi soccer player. So
That's right.
that was
Ronaldo is
interesting
playing
too.
the soccer for Saudi. Yep. Agreed. And so there is a huge push. They want to be a tech leader, and they've got the energy, which is the number one input. So number 4, observation, again, sort of obvious, but worth pointing out. Number 5, labor disruption and populism. AI impacts are likely to include significant transitions for market, for work, and for workers. I'm glad they used the word transitions instead of just job destruction, because I think that is the doomer outlook, whereas I think the reality is that there will be significant transition. We talked last week about how so many new job titles are popping up on LinkedIn that didn't exist 5 years ago. So it doesn't mean, some jobs, more menial or administrative, can be done, can be automated. That doesn't mean those workers are going to sit on their hands and not do anything. It means there's going to be other things to do. And so I'm glad they used the word transition there. Defense leadership. Okay. Number 6, militaries that integrate AI fastest will hold decisive battlefield advantages. I think that's true because it will make decision-making faster. You essentially have, game theory executed in seconds instead of weeks or months. And I think that's right, as well as, more automation, of course, drones. We have a fully unmanned fighter jet being marketed now by Anduril. Technology is going to be the future of warfare. I think there will be a lot less on the ground, boots on the ground fighting. So I agree with that observation. Number 7, energy and hardware is the new choke points. Semiconductors, critical minerals, and electricity capacity define who can scale AI and who risks falling behind. That is true, which is why there has been so much discussion of how can we use the electricity we have in America more efficiently while we create more of it. We need nuclear, we need natural gas, we need everything. And the critical minerals, of course, has been a key topic of conversation. How can the U.S. create and refine more of them? How can we be less dependent upon foreign countries? Of course, we have giant semiconductor plants after the CHIPS Act coming up in America, including in Taylor, Texas, the Samsung plant. So the U.S. is working hard to catch up. We have not had great policies over the last 30 years leading up to this. So it is unfortunately a little bit of catch up, but I think their observation is fair enough. These are the inputs for who can scale the tech. So whoever is the best at it is going to be the most successful. And I think seeing all this investment coming in from some of our allies, I think is going to help us get where we need to be. So I think fair observations from JP Morgan. I don't think they've created a very novel report here, but again, worth repeating these things because they are important issues for how the economy is going to grow into the future. What did I miss on that?
I think you covered it. Made me smile because I felt like I was back in college again, reading an article in like Foreign Affairs or some international relations journal. But I think the big point is that, and U.S. is in a really good position economically, politically, militarily, from a national security perspective to lead and win this race. I think that China is really ambitious. They're investing a ton in energy, much more so than we are. And we have to catch up there to win. But I think it's an interesting article. It's fun to find these little articles here and there and just see what kind of different takes are on how this technology will be applied and its implications in the workplace, in the culture, and all the way to the global geopolitical scale. All right. Well, we'll skip over now to our next segment, and it's a game called What's the Headline? I'll provide the context of an actual news story, and then we'll each supply a made-up headline. So we have 2 fun stories today. So this one's an old story, but it's funny to comment on. So once again, Only President Trump can put on such theatrics. He has made cutting drug prices a major priority, as of a lot of politicians for a long time. But he seems to be getting it done. So he held a press conference in the Oval Office about making weight loss drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy available to Americans at more affordable prices like elsewhere in the world. And of course, he's calling this program Trump RX. You go to trumprx.gov. It's a real website. It's just hilarious. But during the meeting, an executive from one of the drug companies passed out. The video is actually kind of intense to watch. You've got Dr. Oz of TV fame, who's a real doctor, now at CMS, I believe. He sort of calmly turns and catches the man before he hits the ground and knocks himself out. And Dr. Oz is attending to him while people are being escorted out of the Oval Office. So, Brian, President Trump, he announces Trump RX, healthcare executives pass out, and Dr. Oz saves the day. What's the headline?
Yeah. Trump RX, the prices will be so low, you'll pass out. I mean, that's the obvious one. I understand the man is fine and has recovered and all is well, so we don't have to feel too bad but laughing at the story. But that was pretty shocking. And RFK Jr. got harangued because he was seen like kind of running out of the office. The reason was because he was calling the White House medical unit to get them in there to help the guy out. So poor Bobby Kennedy. Can't catch a break.
No. Well, my headline is Trump announces Trump RX plan to cut drug prices. Pharma exec immediately faints at the thought of a smaller bonus.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And story number 2, we're going to take a shot here at Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who is in the Texas House of Representatives for about 5 minutes before she decided she wanted to run for Congress. So she goes to the House floor to condemn Republicans for taking donations from Jeffrey Epstein. Turns out it was not the deceased convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein, but a physician with the same name. And then Crockett goes on TV and tries to wiggle her way out of it, making herself sound more unhinged and incompetent and insane along the way. So, Brian, Jasmine Crockett tries to smear Republicans, but didn't do her homework and now has egg on her face. What's the headline?
Nation's Jeffrey Epsteins changed their names to Jeffrey Epstein, comma, no, not that one. This was a doctor in Long Island, the poor who was donating to candidates. Good Lord.
And I imagine not a terribly uncommon name for that part of the country and people of around that same age. So yeah, it's too bad for people that have those names and you get mixed up with people. My headline is Jasmine Crockett also claims GOP took money from Bigfoot, Hitler, and Darth Vader.
Yeah,
we'll follow. That sounds about right. All right. Well, for our final segment, we'll end in the traditional way with the grab bag segment. And I probably should have done the grab bag segment on Cristiano Ronaldo being at the White House, which was pretty cool. I've always been a Ronaldo over a Messi fan. I know in the soccer world, that's really a controversial battle. Just epic. I mean, truly one of the greatest soccer players ever. So it's fun in the twilight of his career, seeing him kind of transition over into the business world. And he has like 11 trillion followers on social media, which is more than the number of people on the earth. But I'm giving a shout out and a goodbye to WWE legend John Cena, who will have his final match in WWE on December 13th, Brian, in Washington, D.C. So John Cena, he's been a mainstay. He was the sort of heir apparent to Hulk Hogan as the face of the WWE for about 20 years. He's sort of since been eclipsed by people like Roman Reigns and Cody Rhodes that sort of got pushed by Vince McMahon to be the archetype of what a superhero is. But during his final year sort of going away party, he became a 17-time world champion, breaking the great Ric Flair's record for the most championships ever. He recently won the Intercontinental Championship. Becoming a Grand Slam champion means that he's won every major championship in the company. The crowds were getting a little complacent with him. They were just kind of tired of, John Cena, the superhero, winning everything. And then he went away. He went away to Hollywood, and he's really built out a profile. He's been in some comedies. He did Peacemaker, and he's part of that universe. And then he's been coming back part-time over about the last 5 or 7 years. And the crowds have been incredibly kind and welcoming when he does. And so this past year, as I said, he's kind of done this full year retirement tour all around the world. I think he had like maybe over 50 appearances, which is a lot. That's full-time pace. He just had his last appearance in Boston, which is near his hometown of West Newbury, Massachusetts. And then his final Raw appearance, the flagship show for WWE, was in Madison Square Garden last Monday. And they kind of did a greatest hits. They had a 6-man tag match, and they had a couple guys that he used to wrestle with in the, early 2000s, 2010s, and they beat the bad guys of today. And it was just very satisfying. So it's bittersweet to see him retire. But as he says, at 48 years old, his body just can't do it anymore. And he wants to be there and be healthy for his wife, his family, and his friends. And I think you got to respect that. So I'm excited to see who he faces in his final match, and also who gets the honor of retiring the great John Cena. That's one of those things that the person who gets the final match to retire a legend is a great honor. Shawn Michaels, he retired Ric Flair earlier this year. It was Gunther. He retired Goldberg. So we'll see who puts John Cena to bed. So congratulations and thanks to John Cena for being a great part of my childhood and apparently my adulthood and into my middle-aged life.
48 years old. Man, I got to take better care of myself. That's what I am not 48 yet, but good grief. It looks amazing. And I don't want to be too aggressive by saying like he's never made a bad movie, but his movies are generally very good. He's just a talented guy. So good for him. But wrestling until you're 48 is incredible. Good for him. My grab bag item this week, I watched the show Death by Lightning. Sorry, there's some noise in the background here. I watched the show Death by Lightning on Netflix. It is a biopic on President James Garfield, the 20th president of the United States, who was assassinated. He was shot about 3 months into his term. He lived for another 3 months or so. And it was very well done. Michael Shannon starred as Garfield. You had, I can't remember the actor's name, but he was in Succession, starred as the assassin. You had Bradley Whitford as Senator James Blaine. You had Nick Offerman playing Chester A. Arthur, who took over as president when Garfield passed away. It was really well done. Not an upper. So if you're looking for something super fun and uplifting, this ain't it. But the story isn't. It's just a very interesting chapter in American history. The election of 1880 and the aftermath there in post-Civil War America. You learn a lot. It is all kind of heartfelt and touching. When he was president, he still tried to hold office hours for constituents, which I thought was kind of nice. His family was lovely, had a farm in Ohio, just kind of an everyman who unexpectedly became the president, but was cut down in his prime. And how would have American history changed had that crazy guy not assassinated Garfield? Or had we had better Secret Service, had the president had a security detail at that time, how things might have changed? Had medical care improved? This isn't exactly a spoiler because you can Google it, but Garfield didn't actually die of his gunshot wound. He died of sepsis. He died of an infection from the shoddy medical treatment he got after he was shot, because they didn't really know how to do things in a sanitary way in 1880. That wasn't all the rage. So kind of heartbreaking, but a very interesting chapter in American history. It's a quick watch. I think it's like 4 episodes. So if you're looking for a new show, would recommend, but you got to chase it with a sitcom or something, because it's hard to go to bed after watching something so sad, but it is very meaningful and very interesting. On that note, on my history kick, I'm starting to give a chance to Ken Burns' American Revolution documentary, and I don't think I can do it. It's mild. It suffers from a mild to moderate case of wokeness, and it's still PBS, so it's still pretty boring. So I can't really endorse that one, although I always love to learn as much as I can about the American Revolution. Would recommend Death by Lightning. Not yet recommend the American Revolution. So that's my TV diet. I think I need to go back to wrestling. Maybe I need to get tickets to see John Cena's final match. But I digress. We covered a lot of ground in this episode. Thanks for joining us on this roller coaster. Remember to follow me on X at MorgansternNJ. Like and subscribe. Follow the pod on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, Rumble, wherever you get your podcasts. Next week will be Thanksgiving, so we will not be recording an episode, but we will see you all the following week on another episode of the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod. Thanks so much, everybody. See you soon.